The blizzard hit the valley like the hand of an angry god. Sarah McKenna stood at her cabin window, watching the snow fall so thick she couldn't see past her own porch. 43 years old, widow of 6 months, alone in a territory that showed no mercy to the weak. The wind howled through the cracks in the walls like wolves hunting prey, and despite the fire crackling in the hearth, she could see her own breath misting in the frozen air. This was January of 1852, the coldest winter anyone could remember. 3 feet of snow had already fallen, and the storm showed no signs of stopping. Sarah's husband, Thomas, had always handled the harsh winters. He'd reinforced the walls, stocked extra firewood, hunted enough meat to last until spring. But Thomas was 6 feet under now, killed by a falling tree while clearing land last summer. And Sarah was learning the hard way that the frontier didn't care about your grief. It only cared whether you were strong enough to survive. She wrapped her last wool blanket tighter around her shoulders. The cabin had 2 blankets when Thomas was alive. She'd used one to bury him with, couldn't bear the thought of him cold in the ground. Now she had only this one, threadbare and thin, but it was all that stood between her and freezing to death in her own home. The temperature was dropping fast. She could feel it in her bones, that deep cold that crept into your chest and made your heart work harder just to keep pumping. By her estimation, it was well below 0 outside, maybe 20 below, maybe worse. That's when she heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the storm. A soft thump against her door, like something falling, then silence. Sarah stood perfectly still, her heart suddenly hammering against her ribs. Could be an animal seeking shelter, could be a branch blown against the wood, could be something worse. In this territory, anything could be outside your door. Outlaws, deserters, hostile Indians, all looking for an easy target, and a widow alone in a storm was about as easy as targets came. She picked up Thomas's rifle from above the fireplace, checked that it was loaded, and moved slowly toward the door. Another sound, this time unmistakable. A whimper. Weak, desperate, human. Sarah's hand froze on the door latch. Every instinct screamed at her not to open it. Nothing good happened when you opened your door during a blizzard in Indian territory. But that sound, that soft, broken whimper, it wasn't the sound of someone dangerous. It was the sound of someone dying. She threw open the door and the wind nearly ripped it from her hands. Snow blasted into her face, blinding her for a moment. And there, collapsed on her porch in a heap of frozen doeskin and matted black hair, was a child. An Indian child. A girl, no more than 12 years old, her lips blue with cold, her small body shaking so violently Sarah could hear her teeth chattering from 6 feet away. The child's eyes flickered open, dark and unfocused, looking at Sarah but not really seeing her. Looking through her, towards something beyond this world. Sarah had been taught since childhood that Indians were savages, that they killed settlers, burned farms, stole children, that showing mercy to one was the same as signing your own death warrant. But as she stared down at this frozen child on her porch, all she could see was someone's daughter, someone's little girl dying alone in the snow. The decision took less than a heartbeat. Sarah dropped the rifle, bent down, and scooped the child into her arms. The girl weighed almost nothing, her body so cold it felt like holding a corpse. Sarah kicked the door shut against the storm and carried her burden to the fire. The child's skin was pale beneath the tan, her fingers and toes already showing the dark signs of frostbite. Her breathing came in shallow, irregular gasps. Sarah had seen this before in soldiers during the war and travelers caught in storms. This was the final stage, the point where the body gave up fighting and just let the cold win. Minutes, maybe less. That's all the time Sarah had to save this girl's life. She laid the child on the floor in front of the fire and began stripping away the frozen clothing. The doeskin dress was stiff with ice, the leather leggings frozen solid. Underneath, the girl's skin was mottled purple and white. Sarah worked quickly, her own hands shaking, pulling off layer after layer until the child lay naked and shivering on the wooden floor. Then Sarah made a choice that would change everything. She grabbed her last blanket, the only one she owned, the threadbare wool that had been keeping her alive through this brutal winter, and she wrapped it around the Indian girl's frozen body. The cold hit Sarah immediately. Without the blanket, the cabin felt like an ice house. The fire, which had seemed adequate moments before, now felt like a candle trying to warm a cathedral. She could feel the temperature dropping into her bones, settling into her joints, making her fingers stiff and clumsy. But the girl needed this blanket more than Sarah did. At least, that's what Sarah told herself. Though looking at the child's blue lips and vacant eyes, she wondered if either of them would survive the night. Sarah pulled the child closer to the fire, so close she worried the blanket might catch. She rubbed the girl's hands and feet, trying to force circulation back into the frozen flesh. She heated water and made the child drink, tiny sips at first, then more as the girl's throat remembered how to swallow. Hours passed. The storm outside grew worse, if that was possible. The wind sounded like screaming now, and Sarah found herself screaming back at it, defying it to take this child from her. She'd lost her husband. She'd lost her future. She wasn't going to lose this girl too? Somewhere around midnight, the child spoke. Just one word, in a language Sarah didn't understand, but the tone was unmistakable. Mama! The girl was calling for her mother. Sarah felt something crack inside her chest. This child was lost, separated from her family in the worst blizzard in living memory. Her mother was probably out there somewhere, searching desperately, fighting the storm, maybe dying in the snow herself. And here was Sarah, a white woman, a stranger, possibly the enemy, the only thing standing between this girl and death. By dawn, the child's breathing had stabilized. The color was slowly returning to her face. The violent shaking had subsided to occasional tremors. She was going to live. Sarah, on the other hand, wasn't so sure about herself. Without the blanket, she'd spent the night huddled next to the fire, feeding it constantly, burning through wood at a rate that would leave her with nothing by tomorrow. Her whole body ached with cold. Her fingers were stiff, her toes numb. She'd given everything she had to save this child. And now, as the gray light of morning filtered through the windows, she had to face a terrible truth. She had no blanket, almost no firewood, and no way to survive another night like this. The storm had finally broken, leaving behind a world transformed into white silence. 3.5 feet of fresh snow covered everything. Sarah's cabin looked like a small island in an ocean of white. The girl was still sleeping, wrapped in Sarah's blanket, her breathing steady and deep. Sarah stood at the window, watching the sunrise paint the snow in shades of pink and gold, and she felt a strange peace settle over her. If this was how she died, saving a child's life, then maybe it was a good death. Better than freezing alone with nobody to mourn her. That's when she saw them. At first, she thought it was a trick of the light, shadows moving across the snow. But as she stared, the shadows took shape. Riders, dozens of them. No, more than dozens. Hundreds. Apache warriors on horseback, emerging from the trees like spirits materializing from the morning mist. They moved in complete silence, a vast army flowing into her valley like water filling a basin. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. This was it, the moment every settler feared. An Apache war party, and she was alone, defenseless, with one of their children wrapped in her only blanket. She reached for Thomas's rifle, then stopped. What was the point? She couldn't fight 200 warriors, couldn't run through 3 feet of snow, couldn't hide, couldn't bargain, couldn't do anything except face whatever was coming with as much dignity as she could muster. The riders formed a massive circle around her cabin, so large it encompassed her entire valley. Sarah had never seen so many Apache warriors in one place. This wasn't a raiding party. This was something else entirely. Something that made her heart hammer against her ribs like a prisoner trying to escape. If you're enjoying the story of an impossible choice in the Old West, hit that subscribe button, because what happens next will restore your faith in humanity. A single rider detached from the group and rode slowly toward the cabin. An older warrior, his face weathered by countless winters, his bearing suggesting authority that went beyond mere leadership. This was a chief, Sarah realized, a man of immense power, riding toward her door with an expression she couldn't read. Behind him, the warriors sat motionless on their horses, a wall of silent judgment. Sarah's hands trembled as she walked to the door. Every instinct screamed at her to bar it, to hide, to protect herself. But the child behind her was stirring now, making small sounds. And Sarah knew that whatever happened next, she'd have to face it with courage. For the girl's sake, if nothing else. She opened the door. The chief sat on his horse just 20 feet away, his dark eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her feel transparent. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then the chief spoke, his English perfect and clear. "You have my granddaughter." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Granddaughter. This wasn't just any lost child. This was the granddaughter of an Apache chief. The kind of person whose death or disappearance could start wars, could bring destruction to entire settlements. Sarah's voice came out as barely more than a whisper. She was freezing. I couldn't let her die. The chief's expression didn't change. He dismounted slowly, with the careful movements of a man who'd seen many battles and survived them all. He walked to the porch, and Sarah stepped aside to let him enter, knowing she had no choice, knowing that her life was completely in this man's hands now. The chief stepped into the cabin and stopped. Sarah watched his face as he took in the scene. The child sleeping peacefully by the fire, wrapped in a worn blanket, the empty walls where a second blanket should have hung. Sarah herself, shivering in the cold morning air, her own body showing signs of exposure that the chief's experienced eyes would immediately recognize. He walked to his granddaughter and knelt beside her. His weathered hands touched her face gently, checking her temperature, her breathing, looking for signs of frostbite or injury. Then he carefully lifted the edge of the blanket and examined it. Thin, worn, threadbare. The only blanket in the cabin, the only source of warmth besides the fire. And Sarah had given it to his granddaughter without hesitation. The chief stood and turned to face Sarah. His expression was still unreadable, but something had changed in his eyes. Something that looked almost like wonder. You gave her your only blanket. It wasn't a question. Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. The chief looked around the cabin again, taking in details Sarah had stopped noticing. The bare walls, the nearly empty woodpile, the absence of any man's belongings. You are alone here. Again, not a question. Yes, Sarah managed. My husband died last summer. The chief was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that made Sarah's chest tight. My granddaughter went out to gather herbs yesterday morning. She knew a storm was coming. She thought she had time. But the blizzard came early, came fast. We have been searching all night. 3 of my warriors died in the storm, looking for her. I thought I had lost her. Sarah felt tears prickling at her eyes. She thought of this man, this chief, spending the night in that terrible storm, searching desperately for his granddaughter, losing his own warriors in the attempt. The grief that must have torn through him. The moment of finding her here, alive, because a stranger had sacrificed everything to save her. The chief reached out and did something Sarah never expected. He placed his hand on her shoulder, the gesture carrying a dignity and respect that transcended language and culture. You saved her life at the cost of your own. This is the highest honor a warrior can show. You are no longer a stranger to our people. He walked to the door and called out in Apache. Immediately, warriors began dismounting and moving toward the cabin with purpose. Sarah watched in amazement as they worked with incredible efficiency. Some carried bundles of firewood, enough to last the entire winter. Others brought blankets, beautiful woven blankets in patterns Sarah had never seen, warm and thick and obviously valuable. Still others carried food, dried meat and corn and supplies that would keep her fed for months. Within minutes, her cabin was transformed from a place of bare survival to a home of comfort and security, but they weren't finished. The chief gave another command, and warriors began working on the cabin itself. They reinforced the walls, sealing every crack where wind could enter. They repaired the roof, adding layers of protection against future storms. They built up the woodpile until it was taller than Sarah's head. They brought deer meat, smoked and preserved, enough to feed a family through the winter. Sarah stood in the doorway, tears streaming down her face now, unable to comprehend what was happening. This wasn't just gratitude. This was something deeper, something that spoke to a code of honor she was only beginning to understand. The granddaughter woke up. She sat up slowly, confused, looking around the cabin until her eyes found her grandfather. She spoke rapidly in Apache, her voice full of emotion. The chief responded softly, then gestured to Sarah. The girl's eyes went wide. She stood, still wrapped in Sarah's blanket, and walked slowly toward the white woman who had saved her life. Then she did something that broke Sarah's heart wide open. She took off the blanket, folded it carefully, and tried to hand it back to Sarah. No, Sarah said, shaking her head. You keep it. You need it. The girl looked confused. She spoke to her grandfather in Apache, her voice questioning. The chief smiled, the first real smile Sarah had seen on his weathered face, and he explained something to his granddaughter that made the girl's eyes fill with tears. Then the girl did something Sarah would never forget. She wrapped the blanket around both of them, pulling Sarah into an embrace that felt like coming home after a lifetime of wandering. They stood there together, the Apache girl and the white widow, wrapped in one threadbare blanket that had saved both their lives in different ways. The chief spoke again, this time addressing all the warriors gathered in the valley. His voice carried across the snow like thunder, full of authority and emotion. Sarah didn't understand the words, but she felt their power. When he finished, the warriors raised their weapons in unison, a salute that echoed through the mountains. Then something even more remarkable happened. One by one, the warriors began approaching the cabin. Each one carried something, a gift, a token. A piece of their own possessions offered freely. Weapons, tools, blankets, food, jewelry, ceremonial items. They laid them at Sarah's feet with reverence, with respect, with gratitude that needed no translation. By the time the last warrior had paid his respects, Sarah's cabin looked like a trading post. She had more supplies than she'd ever owned in her life, more wealth than Thomas had ever provided, more security than she'd ever known, and all because she'd shown mercy to a freezing child. The chief approached her one final time. He carried something wrapped in soft leather, something he clearly valued deeply. He unwrapped it slowly, revealing a ceremonial necklace made of turquoise and silver, the kind of item that would be passed down through generations, the kind of treasure that represented a family's entire history. "This belonged to my wife," he said softly. "She died giving birth to this girl's mother. It is the most precious thing I own." He placed it around Sarah's neck with hands that trembled slightly. "You are grandmother to her now, as much as I am grandfather. You are family." Sarah couldn't speak, couldn't process what was happening. She'd spent 6 months alone, grieving, barely surviving, convinced that she would die in this valley forgotten and unmourned. And now she was surrounded by more family than she'd ever had, adopted into a tribe she'd been taught to fear, honored by warriors who should have been her enemies. The girl spoke to her grandfather again, urgently, gesturing toward Sarah and then toward the vast assembly of warriors. The chief listened, then nodded slowly. He turned to Sarah. "My granddaughter wants to know if you will teach her your language. She says if she is to have a white grandmother, she should be able to speak to her properly." Sarah laughed, the sound coming out half as a sob. "I would love that. But maybe she can teach me Apache first." The chief smiled again. "That would be wise. You will need it when you come to live with our people." Sarah blinked. "Live with your people?" The chief gestured to the cabin, to the supplies, to the valley. "You cannot stay here alone. This valley is too isolated, too dangerous for one woman. You will come with us when the snows melt. You will have a place among our people, a home, protection, family, if you wish it." Sarah looked around at the warriors, at the girl who still held her hand, at the chief whose eyes held nothing but sincerity and respect. 6 months ago, she would have called this offer madness, a death sentence, a betrayal of everything she'd been taught. But 6 months ago, she hadn't frozen nearly to death saving an Apache child, hadn't seen the honor and humanity in people she'd been taught to hate. "I wish it," she said softly. The chief nodded, satisfied. "Then it is done. You are Sarah McKenna no longer. You are Stands in Snow, the woman who faced death for a stranger's child. That is the name the warriors will sing when they tell this story. That is the name that will be remembered." The rest of the day passed in a blur. The warriors set up camp in the valley. Their numbers so vast it looked like a small city had appeared overnight. They hunted, bringing fresh meat. They sang, their voices carrying through the cold air like prayers. They celebrated, not with wild revelry but with quiet dignity, honoring the recovery of the chief's granddaughter and the courage of the white woman who had saved her. As night fell, Sarah sat by her fire, wrapped in blankets warmer than anything she'd ever owned, the chief's granddaughter sleeping peacefully beside her, and she marveled at how quickly life could change. Yesterday, she was a widow facing death alone. Today, she was grandmother to an Apache child and sister to 200 warriors. The chief visited once more before sleeping, to check on his granddaughter and to speak with Sarah. He sat across from her at the fire, his ancient eyes reflecting the flames. "You wonder why we honor you so greatly for one act of kindness." Sarah nodded. "I gave her a blanket. You've given me everything." The chief shook his head. "You gave her more than a blanket. You gave her your survival. You knew that without that blanket you would likely die. You knew that saving her meant sacrificing yourself. That is not kindness. That is sacrifice. That is warrior's courage." Sarah thought about this. She hadn't really considered it a sacrifice at the time. She'd just seen a dying child and acted on instinct. But the chief was right. She'd known the cost. She'd chosen to pay it anyway. Among our people, the chief continued, there is no greater honor than to give your life for another. The warriors you see here, they would all die for their families. But you were willing to die for a stranger, for an enemy, by your people's reckoning. That is why you are honored. That is why you are family now. He stood to leave, then paused. Tomorrow we will begin teaching you our ways. But tonight, rest. You have earned it, stands in snow. Sarah lay down that night, surrounded by warmth, by safety, by the quiet breathing of a child who would not have survived without her. Outside, 200 Apache warriors stood guard over the valley, protecting their newest family member with the same fierce loyalty they showed their chief. The weeks that followed were unlike anything Sarah had ever experienced. The warriors stayed in the valley until the worst of the winter had passed, and during that time, Sarah became part of their community. The chief's granddaughter, whose name was Istis, meaning snow, became her constant companion and teacher. The girl taught Sarah Apache words, customs, stories. She was patient and gentle, and Sarah found herself laughing more in those weeks than she had in the entire year since Thomas died. The warriors treated her with respect that bordered on reverence. When she walked through their camp, they nodded to her, spoke to her in halting English, shared their food and fire. Sarah learned that these people she'd been taught to fear were not so different from her own. They loved their families. They told jokes. They mourned their dead. They hoped for peace but prepared for war. They were human, beautifully and completely human. One of the warriors, a young man named Takoda, spoke English well. He'd learned it as a child from a missionary. He became Sarah's translator and friend, explaining customs that confused her, helping her understand the complex society she'd become part of. One evening, as they sat by her fire, Sarah asked him the question that had been haunting her. Takoda, why did the chief bring every warrior? Why not just come with a few men to collect his granddaughter? Takoda was quiet for a moment. Then he said, the chief did not know if he would find her alive or dead. If alive, he wanted enough warriors to honor the person who had saved her. If dead, he wanted enough warriors to destroy whoever had killed her. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. You would have burned my cabin? Burned this whole valley? Takoda met her eyes. If you had harmed Istis, there would be nothing left of you or your valley but ash and memory. But you saved her. So instead of destruction, we brought honor. Instead of taking your life, we protected it. That is the Apache way. Justice and honor in equal measure. Sarah understood then just how close she'd come to death that morning. If the chief had found his granddaughter dead, if the cold had taken her before Sarah could act, the warriors would have assumed Sarah had killed her or let her die. They would have destroyed everything without hesitation or mercy. Her act of kindness had saved her own life as surely as it had saved Istis. As winter slowly released its grip on the valley, Sarah prepared to leave the only home she'd ever known. The cabin Thomas had built, the land they'd worked together, the grave where he lay buried. It was hard saying goodbye to that life, but it was also strangely liberating. She was moving forward toward something new, toward people who valued her not for what she could produce or how well she could manage a frontier homestead, but for a single moment of courage. The day came when the snow had melted enough for travel. 240 warriors assembled in the valley one final time. Sarah stood before them, wearing the ceremonial necklace the chief had given her, wrapped in Apache blankets, with Istis holding her hand tightly. The chief addressed his warriors in Apache, his voice carrying across the valley. Sarah didn't need translation to understand the weight of his words. This was a moment being sealed into memory, a story that would be told around fires for generations. Then the chief turned to Sarah and spoke in English. You came to this valley as Sarah McKenna, a widow alone and afraid. You leave it as stands in snow, a warrior of the Apache people. Your courage has built a bridge between our people. Your sacrifice has bought peace where there was only war. You will always have a home among us, always have warriors willing to die to protect you, because you were willing to die to protect one of ours. Sarah felt tears running down her face. She thought about the lonely, desperate woman who had opened her door during a blizzard. She barely recognized that person now. She'd been transformed by mercy, by courage, by the unexpected consequences of choosing compassion over fear. The journey to the Apache settlement took 4 days. Sarah rode beside the chief, with Istis insisting on sharing her horse, wrapped together in blankets against the cold. The warriors sang as they traveled, their voices creating harmonies that seemed to echo off the mountains themselves. It was beautiful and haunting, a sound that belonged to this land in a way Sarah was only beginning to understand. When they reached the Apache village, Sarah was greeted by the entire tribe. Women, children, elders, they all came out to see the white woman who had saved the chief's granddaughter. There was curiosity in their faces, but also warmth, acceptance, welcome. Ista's mother, a woman named Kimamela, embraced Sarah with tears streaming down her face. She spoke no English, but her gratitude needed no translation. She held Sarah for a long time, shaking with sobs, and Sarah understood that she was holding a mother who had almost lost her child, who had spent a night in hell waiting for news, who now had her daughter back because a stranger had been kind. A tipi had been prepared for Sarah, positioned next to the chief's own dwelling. It was large and warm, filled with blankets and supplies, decorated with beautiful artwork. More than she needed, more than she deserved. But the tribe insisted. She was stands in snow. She was honored. She was family. That night there was a feast. The entire tribe gathered, and Sarah found herself at the center of it all, sitting beside the chief, with Istas never more than an arm's length away. They ate, they sang, they told stories. And when the chief finally stood to speak, silence fell across the gathering like snow. He told the story of that blizzard night, how his granddaughter had been lost, how they had searched desperately, how 3 warriors had died trying to find her, how they had given up hope, and then how they had found her, alive and safe, wrapped in a threadbare blanket given by a white widow who had nothing but still gave everything. The tribe listened in absolute silence. When the chief finished, they sat quietly for a long moment, letting the weight of the story settle. Then, as one, they stood and raised their voices in a chant that made Sarah's skin prickle. It was a warrior's chant, a song of honor, and it was for her. Istas leaned against Sarah's shoulder and whispered in halting English, "They sing your name, grandmother. They sing stands in snow. You are one of us now, forever." Sarah wrapped her arm around the girl and let the tears flow freely. She thought about the choice she'd made that frozen night, the simple decision to show mercy to a stranger. She hadn't known what it would cost her, hadn't known what it would bring her. She just acted from the heart, from basic human decency, and that single act had changed everything. Had built bridges where there were only walls, had created family where there was only loneliness, had proved that even in the brutal wilderness of 1852, in a territory torn by violence and fear, human kindness could still work miracles. Sarah lived among the Apache for the rest of her life. She never remarried, never returned to white society. She learned their language fluently, learned their customs, became a respected elder among the women. She taught them English, taught them about the white man's world, helped them navigate the difficult years that followed as more settlers came and the old ways began to fade. Istas grew up strong and beautiful, and when she had children of her own, she named her first daughter Sarah. The 2 women remained inseparable until Sarah's death 37 years later at the age of 80, surrounded by 3 generations of Apache family who loved her. The chief kept his promise. Sarah always had warriors willing to die for her. When settlers attacked the village in 1859, 3 warriors gave their lives defending her tipi specifically because she was stands in snow, because she was honored, because she was family. And when she finally died, peaceful and old, wrapped in the same threadbare blanket she had given to Istas all those years ago, the blanket the tribe had preserved as a sacred relic, she was buried with full warrior honors. Something no white person, man or woman, had ever received before. The story of Stands in Snow was told for generations. It spread beyond the Apache, became legend among all the tribes of the territory. The white woman who gave her only blanket to a dying child. The widow who became a warrior. The stranger who became family. Because that's what Sarah McKenna had done on a frozen night in January of 1852. She'd seen a dying child and hadn't seen skin color or culture or enemy. She'd just seen someone who needed help. And she'd helped. At the cost of everything she had, without hesitation, without expectation of reward, just pure human mercy in its most beautiful form, and sometimes in a world full of violence and hatred, that's all it takes to change everything. One blanket, one act of kindness, one moment of courage. The ripples spread outward forever, touching lives across generations, proving that the greatest power in the world isn't weapons or wealth or strength. It's the simple choice to see humanity in a stranger's eyes and to act with compassion even when it costs you everything. Now click on the video on the screen to hear a story even more powerful than this one, with a twist that will leave you speechless about the true meaning of sacrifice in the Old West.